Good afternoon. So, I came up with the title of this presentation. You might have, if any of you are keeping an eye on the website, realized that my presentation was titled TBD for quite a long time, and I was getting increasingly shorter and less polite requests from Brian Honan for details of my presentation. I didn't know what I was going to talk about. Breaking up with panic mode, I have to confess that I came up with this title, obviously, before the results of the US election. Now I don't know if that's possible. We live in interesting times, to quote Terry Pratchett, and one of the things that this presentation focuses on is our requirement to zoom out. And our requirement to zoom out never got more imperative in cybersecurity than it is doing right now. That we have to focus on more than our individual device situation. We have to focus on more than our individual organization or our industrial sector. We have to look at what's happening globally, because all of that and the next several years will evidence this. All of that will have a huge impact on what the cyber insecurity situation looks like. I mean, you've seen, for example, Chinese pre-positioning. It's been cyber typhoon season recently with Volt Typhoon and Salt Typhoon, and you've seen Chinese state-sponsored activity. You've seen Russian disinformation activity and hacking activity and pre-positioning activity. That's set over the next few years, I think, to become increasingly less predictable and increasingly relevant to how we do business, and for us in this room, how we secure business. So bear that in mind as we talk through, and certainly going forwards, that requirement to zoom out, to consider much more than you're probably used to considering when working out security policies and postures and architectures for your organization. It's absolutely true to say that the attack surface is expanding. Of course, you've got the IT networks that you're all used to securing, kind of the core of the business when it comes to enterprise cybersecurity architectures. But it's much more than that now, and it's much more interconnected than that now. It's also the OT systems, which are becoming increasingly connected. And it's not just the newer designed to be connected OT stuff, it's the older never designed to be connected but has a lifespan of 20, 30 years stuff. All of the stuff that has insecurity by design built into its architecture and built into its digital supply chain. Some of the research, for example, that we did at Forescout, we looked at TCP/IP stacks and found a whole bunch of exploitable vulnerabilities in TCP/IP stacks that were then implemented by many different manufacturers. So there's a whole digital supply chain risk that comes with OT security. It's also medical connected devices in that particular industry, again, are replete with vulnerabilities. They're replete with extremely outdated, unpatchable operating systems. We still have devices in our labs, medical devices, that are still running on Windows 98, on Windows Embedded, Windows CE, stuff that's never going to be patched anymore, replete with all of those vulnerabilities. And other than that, the other area, kind of, to me, it reminds me of like the Upside Down in Stranger Things. You know, like the allegorical version of reality is the IoT within our offices that's very rarely considered. And by IoT, I don't just mean the things that we all think of when we mention IoT, like phones and watches. And it's building management systems. It's VoIP phones. It's the heating, ventilation, air conditioning stuff within an organization. All of that's connected to the exact same network that all of your IT stuff is connected to. All of it is full of vulnerabilities. All of it is unmanaged. Most of it is invisible. And all of these new risks are within every organization today. So for an attacker, they don't see that as different silos. Like, okay, your security organization can't see the IoT devices. That's a different silo. They don't manage the OT stuff. That's the OT team that manages the OT stuff. That's a different silo. Attackers don't care about that stuff. They see this as a fantastic opportunity of interconnected systems that will allow them to gain entry to an organization, maintain persistence, and carry out actions on objectives, whether that's encryption and exfiltration of data, or whether that's interruption to business, or whatever the objective is, or espionage. And if you think about what that landscape looks like right now. In IoT, for example, we do a report every year of the riskiest IoT, or the riskiest connected devices, broken up between IoT, OT, medical, and IT. In IoT, as you can see on the slide, we saw a 136% increase in the number of vulnerable devices year on year from last year to this year. So and this is not an inconsiderable amount of data. In Forescout's device cloud, we're talking about 19 million devices that we can interrogate that we see as vulnerable, 136% increase. That's 33% of those 19 million devices. Incredible amount. And if we talk about OT, it's even worse, because like I said, a lot of these devices were not designed to be connected. Most of them are insecure by design anyway. If you think about vulnerability advisories last year, over 2,000 vulnerability advisories for OT and ICS equipment were published. And of those, 27% of those had no patch available at the time the advisory was published. And from that 27%, 18% also had no mitigation. So it's not really an advisory, it's more of an invitation at that point. And of course, limited visibility applies to all of this. We as security people don't get to see this stuff in our networks. And the same with healthcare. Like I said, the vulnerabilities are everywhere. 63% of the vulnerabilities tracked by CISA's KEV, Known Exploited Vulnerability Database, were present on healthcare networks, and 23% of medical devices had at least one known exploited vulnerability. So this is stuff that's just out there waiting to be exploited. And it's not just the typhoon season stuff, and it's not just the botnets. It's also ransomware threat actors. If we go all the way back to Conti, and you know Conti, those people are still around, right? It's just the Conti group disappeared, but they became Blackbuster, Karakurt, Royal, and a bunch of others. These same operators are still working. And all the way back when they were Conti, they were using IoT exploits, they were publishing tutorials, and remember the Conti chats that got leaked? They were talking about taking advantage of connected devices as initial access points. And we've seen a bunch of different threat actors targeting network-attached storage, VoIP devices. We just published some really good research about some 14 new vulnerabilities in Draytech routers, edge IoT routers. We know this stuff is regularly exploited because for an attacker, it's very attractive way into a network. If you can find an IP camera on the edge of a network, for example, that has an exploitable vulnerability, that gives you your initial access into an organization. You can then move laterally and do data discovery, system discovery, compromise Windows-based systems, and then if it's there, you can move laterally into the OT part of the network, increase the leverage to get someone to pay a ransom. Imagine the situation in a medical environment, for example. Someone gets in through an IP camera, manages to get admin on a Windows endpoint. They build a reverse SSH tunnel back out through the IP camera for command and control. They deploy ransomware throughout the environment. They fire the ransomware, ransom note pops up, and at the same time, they've moved into your OT network and they shut down the lights and the ventilation. It's a much bigger lever to get you to pay the ransom if you can expand across the networks like that. But it's also worth remembering that every attack presents an opportunity. So at the top, you can see what I've classified as the attacker objectives, and at the bottom in green you can see what are the opportunities for you as a defender. So where the attacker is trying to identify weak points within your organization, you can do that too. You can monitor your exposure, you can have external risk management. Where the attacker is looking for that beachhead into the organization, that exposed IP camera for initial exploitation, that also gives you an opportunity to apply these various technologies. Every step in an attack represents an opportunity for the defender. The problem is that we, in security, kind of live in this world where we're drowning in data. I know it's a well-worn trope that the level of burnout in security operations centers, for example, is increasing. People are drowning in alerts. People are drowning in data. That's absolutely true. But it's not only that. One of the things that we find ourselves asking for in security, for example, is more visibility. I need to see more. Let me see more of my network. But that just contributes to this. We're actually quite often difficult at articulating what it is that we want. We don't actually want visibility. We want insight. We don't want to see more. We actually want to understand more, which is a very different challenge. And unfortunately, clarity only exists on the other side of complexity. We've got to get through this complexity and build a much clearer understanding. We're also historically bad at choice. The more choices we have within an interface, the more data that's presented to us, the more things we could do makes it more difficult for us to decide what we should do. So we need to work out how we can rationalize the data and understand the data more clearly. There's a mathematical hypothesis called Bernoulli's hypothesis. Weirdly, it was originally applied to fluid dynamics, but he started to think about economics as well. And it's about risk and consumer choice. Why are people willing to take a risk on a certain outcome? And why are some people not? And what it basically boiled down to is the more money you have, the less marginal utility every extra dollar has. Right? So if you have very little money and you stand to gain 1,000, that has an awful lot of marginal utility to you. It could be the difference between, paying your rent this month or not. But if you're extremely wealthy, 1,000 is probably relatively worthless. So the marginal utility of that same amount of money is much lower. And that's absolutely true when it comes to data in cybersecurity. The more data you have, the marginal utility of every extra little bit of data gets less and less. And in fact, I believe, can lead to a negative utility when it comes to cybersecurity. Once you finally have more data than you can deal with, you're actually getting negative returns from that visibility. So we need to make sure that we're asking for the right thing. We're asking for insight and not simply visibility. The truth is, and this goes back to that thing about zooming out, there's always more than one dot. And we have tended historically to focus on the dot. So this is the thing that's very important. This is the thing that I have to look at. But we have this requirement to zoom out. But actually, even when you can see all the dots, or maybe what you think is all the dots, it's still not entirely clear what you're looking at, right? Does anyone know what this is? Is anyone particularly good at dot to dot? Could be like a JCB, right? Like a digger. So, or I could just be misleading you by telling you what I want you to believe the dots represent, and then you see it. This is the problem with visibility. The more we focus on something, the less we understand what it is we're looking at. Like, this is relatively disgusting, I apologize. What do you think you're looking at? It's just an apple. But if you focus down on the detail, you get lost, right? So if that's an apple, then this is pencil. Very good. Yeah, it's a pencil. But if it's so difficult once you're down in the details to understand, and this is an area, kind of linking back to what Bob was talking about, this is an area where AI really can help us as defenders to manage this huge amount of data. If you're like me, when I was at school, maths was absolutely not my strong point. I blame it on Mr. Lewis, by the way. It's all his fault. Fully. There's a whole story there, by the way. We don't have time for that now. So words like algorithm can be kind of off-putting when you start to talk about AI is already like a deeply scientific subject, and then it's like, and it's maths as well, and this is awful. If you're that kind of person, it's worth remembering that an algorithm is nothing more than a series of steps to achieve a desired outcome. It's nothing more than a recipe for baking a cake. Like if you have just a pile of ingredients and no instructions on which order to do what things to those ingredients, good luck on making the cake, right? The recipe is the algorithm, how you combine those things, at what temperature, in which way, for how long, to achieve the desired outcome. So we're using algorithms in cybersecurity much, much more at the moment. Bob detailed a few of them. We use them for finding a baseline, for example. We use them for identifying deviations from that baseline. We use them for finding spam. We use them for finding exploits, identifying malware. And increasingly, we're beginning to use them in making data more understandable to you, the cybersecurity practitioner. There are different algorithms for different purposes. Machine learning is great for anomaly detection, neural networks for pattern matching. There's all different applications of different kinds of technology to help us achieve this. And we're beginning to see all of that engineered into SIEM and SOAR technologies, for example, XDR technologies, as AI becomes more present more often within our security solutions. What these algorithms are doing is refining that huge and growing amount of data into something which is actionable, something which you can actually do something with. So acquiring these vast quantities of data, doing the pre-processing to normalize that data, to turn it into something where you're not comparing apples with oranges, but a series of equally valuable, equally comparable data points, doing the modeling analysis and drawing conclusions, and then deploying those as rules, deploying those as strategies within your organization. But monitoring on an ongoing basis for continual refinement. One of the areas where I think we're going to see incredible growth of that application is within automation. So automation is absolutely the backbone of a scalable cybersecurity solution. Obviously, the capability to automate has been around for a very long time. I remember a long time ago when I used to work on support for Gauntlet firewalls, so that would have been in the 90s. There was the capability to take an automated action based on a firewall alert from the firewall. So you see malicious activity from an IP address and you block that IP address. But the problem with that kind of automation is that it was very binary. It was malicious activity detected, block the IP address. So then actually threat actors were using that as a way to denial of service or make somebody denial of service themselves by spoofing an IP, making it look like it was doing something bad, and then you block an IP address that you absolutely need, like DNS, for example. So like a binary action is not at all comparable to what we could achieve, and I don't think we're at this stage yet, what we could achieve with automation combined with artificial intelligence, where there is a learning loop and a reinforcement loop, where, for example, we track your progress through an event, through the management of an event within your organization, and as a part of that refinement over time, we can say, okay, so last time this kind of thing happened, these were the steps that we took. These are the suggested improvements to the automation flow. Would you like to implement them? Yes, please. The problem is we have this whole trust in technology barrier to overcome, which I think is going to be a much more long-term thing. Let's face it, there are still people deploying intrusion prevention IPS as IDS, right? Because they still don't trust that you can put it in block mode inline. They just want to be alerted. And we still live in that world, unfortunately. But that's not a world where we'll be creating what I want to call sustainable cybersecurity. Now, I don't have the balls to say this is another cybersecurity framework, and I would hate to land you with another cybersecurity framework, to be honest. But I think this is a way to look at existing things like the NIST framework to see if you're implementing that in a more sustainable way. And I don't mean sustainable in terms of green electricity. I mean sustainable as a strategy within your organization. You need to begin with your security policies, make sure that they're policies that you can actually implement, that you have the tools to be able to enforce the policies that you've created. Otherwise, it's nothing more than, well, I was going to say ink on paper. It's not even that, right? It's nothing more than bits and bytes. But so make sure that the policies that you have are actually actionable through technology, and make sure that you're combining intelligence across asset, that's the visibility part, risk, and threat, not just threat intelligence. You need to understand what you have, what you're securing, your asset list, and it needs to include everything, not just IT. So what you're defending, you need to understand risk intelligence. How might that stuff be abused? What does my current security posture look like? Does it match up with my security and my risk appetite? My risk posture, how does it compare to what I said I was willing to accept? Am I matching up with that? And threat intelligence, who and what am I defending against? So what am I defending? How vulnerable is it? And who and what am I defending it against? That's the anticipatory part of cybersecurity intelligence, way beyond just threat intelligence. Once you've got those policies, you understand your environment, then of course you act. But acting is absolutely about automation and acceleration. Automate the shit out of stuff. Because it frees up your teams to be doing much more useful work for you. If you can automate the time-consuming triage work, the drudge work, then you can build a much more forward-looking, threat-hunting, cybersecurity educating SOC team. They're not just stuck at the desk looking for false positives and false negatives, looking for wrongly classified alerts, for example. They can proactively threat hunt within the organization. They can go out and engage with the rest of the business and do cybersecurity awareness stuff. And automation is a tool to allow you to achieve that and build for long-term resilience. It's funny. I had an epiphany recently about resilience related to my daughter. I posted about it on LinkedIn. So my youngest is 6 years old and she has alopecia, so she has no hair. She's been kind of cool with that. She's well aware that she doesn't look like a Disney princess that she loves on TV, like she gets that. But she's kind of okay with it. But I live in Poland, and you start school at 6 in Poland. And we were saying she really needs to start school without a wig because we don't want to have a secret that people can uncover. You know what I mean? Like, if she goes with a wig and there's some asshole who goes, ha ha, you're bald, that's going to be a terrible outcome. So if she could start without the wig, that would be probably better for her long term. So she started. She knew that was the plan. So quite soon after, she was saying, can I have a wig now? Can I have a wig now? We said, yep, let's go and sort it. So we sorted it. It's not cheap. We sorted it, and she was amazed, and her face lit up, and she loved having this wig on, and she was like, it's amazing, it's great. She ran off down the street to get back in the car and go home. We decided to stop at a restaurant on the way home for like a celebration and stuff, and the restaurant had like a kids' play area. She was sitting at the table and she wanted to go play. So I'm going to go to the parents. I said, okay. And she's like, left it on the table and went to play. She's hardly worn it since. She wore it to school the next day. All the kids loved it. They were like, wow, it looks beautiful. You've got great hair. It broke the ice so she could make some friends on that day. And she's hardly worn it since. And that was my epiphany about resilience, is that actually resilience is not the wig. Resilience is something internal to a person or a system or an architecture that gives it its ability to bounce back. It's not about all the things that we put around it. We don't build resilience. We can enable it, but you need to look at those individual things within your network and consider how each of those are in isolation resilient. Build technologies that enable it, but resilience is an internal quality. Sorry for that tangent, it just seemed relevant. But I think what's missing from many of the frameworks out there is approaching this from a learning and a self-sustaining framework. So we need to learn from every event. That's why I'm saying that integrating AI into SIM and SAW, for example, is probably the next big thing, because we need to be able to iterate on this deployment on a dynamic, ongoing, daily basis, learning from what we have, learning from what we defend against, learning from outcomes, and reconfiguring, and keep going around that loop. So in terms of specific approaches and technologies for building this, for breaking up with panic mode, and for building something which allows you to stop the firefighting, the trench warfare, the knee-jerk reactions to events within the organization, is about this constant updating and evolution. So using integrated, holistic, and contextually relevant intelligence to create insight within your organization, to have policies that are based on your risk posture and your risk profile, understanding what it is you want to achieve, what you're willing to accept, and making sure that you can continue to measure and act on that. Make sure that those policies are adaptable, and of course make sure that they're tested. And when you're responding, that's a dynamic, real-time, orchestrated, automated response where you can, again, in an automated way, pull the data out of what you've been doing so that you can learn from it, so that you can evolve and go on and continue to adapt. And like with resilience, like I said, it's enabling the essence of resilience within the assets that you have. So building an architecture like implementation of a zero trust architecture doesn't make you resilient, but it enables the resilience within the systems that you have, as long as you approach it from that. Making sure that you can achieve that business continuity, and that you can bounce back from bad events, that you have a recovery plan. That's something, again, which relates back to testing and making sure that that's happening on an ongoing basis. And all of this can be enabled through the application of AI within your cybersecurity architecture. It's time to stop looking at vendors and saying, what are you doing with AI? And to start looking at yourselves and say, what are we doing? How can we better use this mountain of data that we generate on a daily basis within our organization to improve our own processes, our own policies, our own architectures? Thank you very much.